30 days ago, I made a decision that made zero financial sense on paper. I had $400 in savings, almost $9,000 in credit card debt, and a paycheck that was supposed to cover both. And the very first thing I did with that paycheck, before rent, before groceries, before the minimum payments, was give 10% away. Not because I had margin, because the Bible told me to. For 30 days, I decided to stop just believing scripture and start actually living by what it says about money. All 7 biblical wealth principles, every single day, no shortcuts, no skipping the uncomfortable ones. And by day 22, something happened that I still can't fully explain. By the end of this video, you'll understand why. But first, let me show you where I actually started. Here's the honest picture. I was making decent money, emphasis on decent. Enough that I had absolutely no excuse for my financial situation. And that was the part that stung. I had $400 in a savings account I called an emergency fund, even though it wouldn't survive an actual emergency. I had $900 spread across 3 credit cards, and every month money came in, money went out. And I had this quiet, persistent financial anxiety I just lived inside. It colored how I slept. It colored how I showed up at work. It was like background noise I'd stopped hearing but couldn't turn off. The moment that changed everything was a conversation with a friend. We were talking about faith, and I said something like, "I genuinely believe God is my provider." He looked at me and said, "Does your bank account agree with that?" He wasn't being harsh, he was being honest. And I didn't have an answer. So I committed to 30 days, 7 biblical principles, every single day. Here's what they were. Fast. Stewardship. Treating everything I owned as belonging to God, not me. First fruits. Giving 10% first, before a single bill was paid. Debt elimination. Treating every dollar of debt as spiritual bondage to break. Diligent planning. A budget reviewed every single morning. Multiplication. Putting something into savings or investment every week, no matter how small. Radical generosity. Giving beyond the tithe at least once a week. And mind renewal. A morning journal practice. Identify one scarcity thought, replace it with a kingdom mindset thought. Every single morning. There is one principle on this list I thought would be the easiest. It turned out to be the one that broke me. I'll tell you which one by the end of this video. By day 22, something happened that changed the trajectory of this whole challenge. But I need you to see how I got there first, because the getting there is everything. Week 1 was not inspired. It was not energized. It felt like running uphill in sand. Day 1, payday. I opened my banking app, set up the transfer for 10%, before rent, before groceries, before anything. And my flesh practically screamed at me. You have $9,000 in debt. You cannot afford to give right now. The thought was so loud I had to sit there and breathe through it. But I hit confirm. And after I did, something quiet settled in me. Not financial peace, something smaller but realer. Obedience. I wrote in my journal that morning, I did the thing I was afraid to do. God saw it. The stewardship shift took longer. Saying, "This is God's money," felt like religious vocabulary for the first few days, not lived reality. But around day 4, I was standing in a grocery store choosing between 2 items. One was on sale, and I caught myself thinking, would I be careless with someone else's money? The answer was no, so I chose the one on sale. It was a $3 decision, but it was the first moment stewardship felt like something I was actually doing instead of just saying. Day 5, I looked at my credit card statements through the lens of Proverbs 22:7. The borrower is slave to the lender. I listed every debt I had and labeled the document chains. Not to be dramatic, to be accurate, because that word, bondage, finally matched what I was actually carrying, and it motivated me in a way spreadsheets never had before. I have to be honest about something, though. Day 5 almost ended the challenge entirely. I had an unexpected car expense, $340. Every instinct told me to pause the giving, skip the savings contribution, just survive the week. I sat with that decision for almost 2 hours. I didn't skip the principles, but I will not pretend it wasn't a battle, because it absolutely was. By day 7, my bank account looked basically identical to day 1, but something was shifting that I wasn't tracking on any spreadsheet. Week 2 was nothing like week 1. The resistance was still there, but the fog was starting to thin. The mind renewal practice became the anchor of my entire day. Every morning, one scarcity thought written out, one kingdom replacement written below it. One morning in week 2, I wrote, scarcity thought, there's never enough for me to get ahead. And the kingdom thought I wrote back was, Deuteronomy 8:18 says, God gives me the ability to produce wealth. Ahead isn't a destination, it's a direction I'm already moving in. I sat with that for a while, because I realized I'd spent years defining getting ahead as a finish line I hadn't crossed yet. I'd never once framed it as a direction I was already facing. That's a small reframe on paper. It was enormous in practice. The generosity moment in week 2 caught me off guard. I felt prompted, and I can only call it that, to quietly cover a coworker's lunch. Maybe $12. I didn't announce it. And walking back to my desk, I felt something I can only describe as expansion. Like something inside me got bigger instead of smaller. Luke 6:38 says, give, and it will be given to you. And something in me started believing that verse for the first time in a way that went past reading it. I also took my first multiplication step. I set up an automatic weekly transfer of $25 into a high-yield savings account. $25 against $9,000 in debt. That might sound almost laughable, but the parable of the talents was never about the amount. It was about faithfulness with what you already have, and that $25 felt like a declaration, like I believed more was coming. By the end of week 2, I was starting to understand something I hadn't expected. Biblical finance isn't a collection of money tips. It's a complete rewiring of how you see yourself in relation to money. And that rewiring takes repetition. Quick pause. If this is speaking to you, hit subscribe right now, because what happens in week 3 is exactly why I believe every believer needs to try this. Back to it. Week 3 is where the challenge became something else entirely. The breakthrough didn't come the way I expected. There was no windfall, no dramatic financial miracle. It was quieter than that, and somehow more powerful. On day 18, during my morning journal, I wrote a scarcity thought I hadn't written before. It was this: I'm not the kind of person who builds wealth. On day 18, during my morning journal, I wrote a scarcity thought I hadn't written before. It was this: I'm not the kind of person who builds wealth. From years of hearing in church that wanting money was spiritually suspect, from silently comparing myself to people who seemed to have it figured out, that single sentence had been running like background code in my mind for probably a decade. I replaced it with this: I am a steward of God's resources. Wealth building isn't about who I am. It's about whose I am and what I do with what He entrusts to me. Something shifted after I wrote that. I'm not going to oversell it, but something broke loose. The very next day, day 19, I got a call about a small freelance project. It brought in an extra $400 I hadn't planned for. Now, I want to be careful here. I am not telling you that your journal entry will generate income the next morning. That is not what this video is about. What I am telling you is that I had been walking through life with a deeply buried belief that I was excluded from wealth. And when that belief started to dissolve, I started noticing opportunities I would have previously talked myself out of. I took the project, because for the first time I believed I was supposed to. The giving in week 3 was also different. I gave $60 to a cause I genuinely cared about, on top of my tithe. And I did it with zero anxiety. Not zero sacrifice, zero anxiety. That was the tell. The absence of fear around the giving meant something had actually changed. By day 21, I stopped thinking of this as a 30-day challenge. I started thinking of it as just how I live now. Week 4 was about taking an honest inventory, real numbers. In 30 days, I paid off $780 in credit card debt, more than I had paid in the previous 4 months combined. My savings went from $1,400 to $1,725. In the grand scheme of my financial situation, that's not life-changing. I want to be genuinely honest with you about that. But the trajectory had completely reversed, and trajectory matters more than a 30-day snapshot. The principle that shocked me most was mind renewal. I did not walk into this challenge expecting a journaling habit to have financial consequences. But when I tell you that replacing one scarcity belief at a time changed the decisions I made with money, I mean that in the most practical, traceable way. I started saying yes to income opportunities I used to shrink from. I stopped making fear-based spending decisions, the kind where you overspend to feel okay or underinvest because you're convinced it won't work anyway. The hardest principle to maintain: radical generosity. Every single week, some part of me built a case for why this was the week to hold back. The voice of scarcity is persistent. I had to beat it back every time. And now, the open loop from week 1. I said one principle would break me. It was first fruits. Giving before a single bill cleared. Every paycheck. That one required me to trust God's faithfulness before I saw evidence of it. And that is not natural. That is supernatural. And it was the most important one precisely because of that. If I started this challenge over, I'd do 3 things differently. First, I would tell someone from day one. I kept this private for the first 2 weeks, and I think I made it harder than it needed to be. Accountability isn't weakness, it's wisdom wrapped in relationship. Second, I would rebuild my budget structure completely before day one. I was trying to apply kingdom principles to a broken financial system. Both matter. The spiritual framework and the practical infrastructure have to work together. Third, I would journal longer in week 1. I was writing 2 or 3 sentences. By week 3, I was filling whole pages. The practice compounds. I left value on the table early. The mistake I made? I skipped 1 morning of journaling in week 2. Told myself I'd do it later. I never did. And that day, I made 2 spending decisions I regretted by evening. Not catastrophic, but the connection was clear enough that I never skipped again. The morning practice isn't optional, it's the engine. Here's what I need you to see. These 7 principles are not a 30-day financial hack. They are the architecture of a life built to last. Deuteronomy 8:18 says, "But remember the Lord your God, for it is He who gives you the ability to produce wealth." That verse used to sound like Sunday morning encouragement. Now it sounds like a covenant, a promise with a condition. Remember God, walk in His ways, and the ability to produce wealth is already part of your inheritance. I'm not talking about getting rich. I'm talking about something more valuable. Freedom from the cycle. Freedom from the low-grade financial anxiety that runs in the background of your life. Freedom from the lie that your financial story has already been written and there's nothing you can do about it. I'm talking about building something your children inherit, not just money, but the wisdom that produces money. A financial legacy rooted in biblical stewardship and kingdom finances. That is what this is about. And it starts with one decision, made over and over again, until it becomes who you are. I'm not asking you to start with 30 days. Start with 7. Pick one principle from this list, just one, and apply it with everything you have for 7 days. If it's the mind renewal journal, do it every morning without skipping. If it's first fruits, give first on your next paycheck before anything else clears. If it's multiplication, set up one automatic transfer this week, even if it's $10. Just one principle, 7 days. And then come down to the comments and tell me which one you chose and what day 1 looked like for you. I am going to be in those comments. I want to read every single response. If this video helped you see biblical money principles differently, if it gave you a framework for faith and finances that actually connects to your real life, subscribe. Because this channel exists for one reason, to help believers stop leaving God's financial wisdom on the page and start living it. That is the mission of Kingdom Wealth HQ, and I am genuinely glad you're here. Next week, I'm going deeper on Principle 7, the mind renewal practice, because I believe it is the single biggest reason Christians stay financially stuck when they absolutely do not have to. That video is coming. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it. Until then, steward well, give boldly, and remember, the wealth you're building isn't just for you, it's for the kingdom. See you next week.